morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar this morning. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands, of all the lands on which we're meeting today, and from which we're joining this webinar. And I'll pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and also to the elders of the other communities who may be joining this webinar. The webinar this morning is being hosted by the Australian-German Energy Transition Hub and the Climate and Energy College. And my name's Rebecca Burden. I'm the Managing Director of the Energy Transition Hub. I'd like to mention that the webinar is being recorded and will be available after the event on our website at the Energy Transition Hub. And we would encourage you to ask questions, which we'll come to at the end after Cameron has finished speaking. To do that, please submit your questions throughout the presentation by clicking on the chat and typing your question in there. If you could at the same time click the raise hand button, it'll be easy to identify you and invite you to ask your question later during the question and answer session. I will invite you to speak your question out loud, but if anyone's microphone is not working, we can also just do that for you. So without wasting any more time, I'll introduce you now to Cameron Butler, who's speaking for us this morning. We're delighted to have him joining us. Cameron is a senior analyst at ClimateWorks Australia. Since joining there in 2017, he's conducted research and analysis for numerous projects in the ClimateWorks Pathway and Investments Program, particularly related to long-term emissions reduction scenarios. Most recently, Cameron has been responsible for the technical analysis and authorship of ClimateWorks Decarbonisation Futures report. And throughout 2018, he co-led the Natural Resources and Energy Workstream of CSIRO's 2019 Australian National Outlook. So he's very well placed to speak to us this morning. We're really excited he can join us, and he's really well placed to answer all sorts of difficult technical questions at the end as well. Cameron, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay, hopefully that's come through for everyone there. Okay, so hi everyone, thanks for joining. As Rebecca sort of gave a run through, my name's Cameron Butler. I'm a senior analyst at ClimateWorks Australia, and yeah, really pleased to present our new report, Decarbonisation Futures, Solutions, Actions and Benchmarks for a Net Zero Emissions Future, which was released around a month ago now. So there's a couple of things I wanted to run through today. Start off with a bit of context and general sort of project overview before running through some key findings and summary of the different sectors that we've looked at in the report. Then hopefully have a good amount of time for some questions at the end, and obviously happy to take any offline as well if we do run out of time. So a little bit about ClimateWorks for those who might not know us. We're an independent, not-for-profit organisation working within the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. We're funded through a combination of philanthropy as well as some project funding from industry and government on our various projects. We were established around 10 years ago, really to act as a bridge between research and action in the climate space. And since then, we've specialised primarily in identifying pathways to net zero emissions by 2050 across all sectors of the Australian economy. So for those who have followed us over the years, you might be familiar with our 2014 work, which was our Deep Decarbonisation Pathways project. This was the first report really showing that Australia can reach net zero emissions by 2050 domestically. Decarbonisation Futures is more or less an update of this work, involving a near 2-year investigation of various energy and emissions impacts across a range of potential abatement solutions under multiple scenarios, which I'll get into in a second. The analysis covers the whole of economy, so broken down into 5 main sectors, being electricity, transport, buildings, industry, and agriculture and land. Broadly, Decarbonisation Futures does 4 things. Provides a review of technologies available to reduce emissions in the Australian economy, looks at what governments, businesses and individuals can do to accelerate the development and the deployment of those technologies. We've modelled 3 main scenarios as part of the project, which all achieve net zero emissions by or before 2050, with each of these transitions compatible with either a 2 or a 1.5 degree limit on global warming. And we also present some benchmarks towards the end of the presentation today and at the start of the main report, detailing a little bit of the progress or required uptake of various technologies and broader energy and emissions measures to assess whether we're on track around 2030. I'll just quickly step through a little bit more general context and modelling approach taken in the next couple of slides. Some likely familiar context for this audience, but obviously in 2015, all of the world's governments agreed to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts to limiting this increase to 1.5 degrees. And since then, what we've seen is that the targets of net zero emissions by 2050 or earlier have really become the norm, followed by governments, businesses and investors, both in Australia and around the world. So all Australian states and territories now have some form of a net zero target in place. Over 100 countries, investors worth more than $4 trillion, and some of Australia and the world's biggest companies have also committed to this goal. Quite importantly, what we've been seeing is that while at the beginning, this primarily involved companies in lower emitting sectors like property and technology, recently it's extended to companies in much higher emitting sectors such as heavy industry and freight. For example, Qantas and Rio having recently announced net zero targets by 2050, which is relatively significant. So when we think about avenues to emissions reductions, generally we group them under 4 main pillars, as we've termed them. First being energy waste reduction, in particular through energy efficiency and a shift away from energy intensive products and services. Second pillar being moving to 100% renewable electricity as quickly as possible. Then electrification and fuel switching, basically switching everything that we can to electricity powered by this renewable electricity, and moving everything else that we can away from fossil fuels towards zero or near zero emissions alternatives. Finally, we reduce non-energy emissions as much as possible and offset the residual amount. So as part of the project, we conducted quite an extensive literature review and considered a huge range of various emissions reduction solutions at different levels of maturity. We found it quite useful to group technologies under this simplistic sort of framework here, which essentially calls for, with the mature and demonstrated technologies, really it's about accelerating the deployment of these technologies. And for those that are more at the emerging stage of maturity, it's about accelerating the development and demonstration of these technologies, particularly in those harder to abate sectors, so particularly so they're available to be ready for deployment at scale in the coming decades. Also, probably important to note that this work, being a 2-year endeavour, was conducted and more or less completed pre-COVID, which has obviously since thrown a lot of things into disarray somewhat. The good news is that in relation to this current context that we find ourselves in, that really implementing the actions suggested by our research can not only help Australia get on track to net zero, but can also potentially support efforts to rebuild our economy post-COVID, delivering a potential double win for Australia's economy. So I can do this in a number of ways, can create jobs immediately in sustainable industries, better protected from future shocks, can deliver immediate benefits to vulnerable individuals and businesses through things like lower energy bills or improved health outcomes due to lower pollution and better in-home comfort. It can also help Australia increase its self-reliance and potentially build new industries and export markets. So in particular, large opportunities exist, for example, in things like renewable hydrogen and green steel and aluminium manufacturing, which some research suggests could be on par with our existing fossil fuel exports. So in fact, this current climate that we find ourselves in could actually be quite an exciting opportunity to kickstart a lot of these really important areas. So as I said, we conducted a similar piece of research in 2014, so worthy to have a quick reflection on what's changed in the interim. And by far the most remarkable progress has been achieved in the space of renewable electricity generation and batteries. By way of a few statistics, solar installations achieved in 5 years what was meant to take around 20. The cost of new wind and solar, even when including additional costs of storage, is now lower than that of coal generation. Batteries have followed a similarly remarkable route of cost reduction. They now cost some 80% less than in 2010, which happened much faster than anyone expected. And what this has done is really supported a boom in electric vehicles, with there now being more than 3 million of these vehicles in the world on the road. Quite excitingly, we've also seen a lot of progress in what we call the hard to abate sectors. So this includes sectors like large industry, heavy transport, and some agricultural sectors, where back in 2014, it was really hard to imagine, let alone model, a zero emissions future in these sectors. In particular, progress in batteries means that electrification is now a solution which could be applied to even more transport modes. So we're seeing things like small electric planes and short-haul electric ferries in operation in some places in Europe. And it's also increasingly likely that heavy trucks could also be electrified in the future. Another example is engineered wood products, which could potentially replace steel and cement in the construction of mid-sized buildings. There's an example of one such building in King Street in Brisbane. And also the potential replacement of beef products through things like plant-based alternatives, which are expected to represent a fairly big share of the market in the future. So those are just a few examples. As I mentioned, our report reviews all major emissions reduction technologies and solutions across sectors, or all that we could identify as part of our literature review. And we found that the progress achieved in the last 5 years has really closed that technical gap to zero emissions in all sectors of the economy. So summarised here, you'll see that in electricity and buildings, zero emissions is really doable with technologies that are already mature or demonstrated, in particular through things like renewable storage and energy efficiency. In the transport sector, the solutions are at differing levels of maturity depending on the particular transport mode. So as mentioned, cars and short-haul transport are looking increasingly likely to be electrified in the near to medium term, whereas for long-haul, this is more likely to require a range of zero emissions fuels. So these might include biofuels, especially second and third generation biofuels that don't compete with food production, as well as hydrogen and ammonia produced from renewable electricity, or in some cases, synthetic fuels. In industry and agriculture, commonly termed the more hard to abate sectors, many of the zero emissions solutions are very much still at the emerging stage. Now, that's not to say that there isn't anything that can be done now. In those sectors, in the short term, it's really about focusing on the deployment of best practice technologies, for example, in energy and other resource efficiency, while also ensuring that we're setting ourselves up to be ready to deploy the new technologies when they will be available in the coming decades. As part of this research, we've also included nature-based solutions such as carbon forestry, which can help compensate any residual emissions from other sectors where zero emission solutions are not currently available. In the last 5 years, unfortunately, one development which hasn't been as positive is the trend in global emissions, which have kept increasing over the period. What this means is that we've lost very valuable time, and that the necessary decrease towards zero emissions needs to be a lot steeper than if we'd started action 10 or 20 years ago. I'm presuming that this audience has some understanding of the concept of carbon budgets, which was the approach that we took in this project. The chart on this slide essentially shows the remaining global carbon budgets for both 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming, which we've updated to the start of 2020. The key takeaway here being that to have a good chance of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees, the remaining global carbon budget corresponds to around 8 years of emissions at current rates. For a 2 degree outcome, this is around 26 years of current emissions. This demonstrates that really we need to start our journey towards zero emissions as soon as possible. The good news being that, as you'll hopefully see, the technologies are now available to allow us to really leapfrog to those zero emissions equipment and processes and keep those goals within reach. So from here, I'll turn a little bit more to some specific modelling results. So as I mentioned, as part of this project, we modelled 3 scenarios and presented here in our triangle framework. So what you're looking at here is we've considered 3 different sort of buckets or drivers of emissions reduction, being technological progress, policy action, or action by businesses and individuals. And the triangles are meant to represent, or the sort of outer extremities of the triangle are meant to visualize the varying strength that we've applied those settings in each of our three scenarios. Firstly, our 2C deploy, which is a scenario most analogous to our 2014 Deep Decarbonisation pathways work. This focuses really on the accelerated deployment of those demonstration and mature stage technologies, which is achieved in particular through strong policy action. Whereas our 2C innovate scenario models technological improvement more at the upper bounds of current expectations, with policy playing more of a supporting role and some demand impact from businesses and individuals as well. So both of those scenarios are compatible with an Australian carbon budget for 2 degrees, whereas our 1.5C all-in scenario is so named because it really does require that concerted effort across all three dimensions that we've considered in this modelling, and that shows how the combination of policy, technological innovation and action by businesses and individuals can help limit emissions to a level compatible with 1.5 degree increase. Important to note that all three of our scenarios assume typical economic conditions. So what that means is we don't include possible structural changes to the Australian economy. So we haven't included things like potential new industries such as renewable hydrogen, which unfortunately just came a little bit late for the sort of scoping and setup of this project. And it means that, as I mentioned, this was also done pre-COVID, so it doesn't include any of its impacts or other sort of black swan events of its ilk. This project also leverages the collective knowledge of both ClimateWorks Australia and CSIRO, who partnered with us on the program, and it utilises the newly developed AusTimes model. This is a custom localised version of the Times model used by many around the world, developed and maintained as part of the International Energy Agency's Energy Technology Systems Analysis Program, or ETSAP. And for those interested, there's much more detail about the AusTimes model and the various subsectors that we've considered in the technical report, which there will be a link to at the back end of this pack. Now, moving into some results. So key takeaway from this is that, I guess, our scenario analysis shows that Australia can still achieve trajectories compatible with reaching the Paris climate goals. However, it also shows that these trajectories involve very strong emissions reductions this decade in particular. What this translates to is approximately a 50% reduction below 2005 levels in 2030 for a 2 degree scenario or 2 degree outcome, and a 75% reduction versus 2005 for the 1.5 degree scenario. Also, I might note that while it doesn't look like there's much variation in those two degree scenarios when you look at this sort of aggregate level, there are some key differences at the sector and subsectoral level that get a little bit lost here in this particular chart and hopefully become a bit clearer in later slides or in the additional detail in the main report. So in terms of what it looks like at the sectoral level, these three graphs represent emissions by sector for each of the scenarios. So the yellow dotted line, not sure how well it will show up on the screens, but there is a yellow dotted line there which is meant to represent the emissions trajectory for the electricity sector. For the purpose of this chart, we've counted electricity emissions in the relevant end use sectors. And the red dotted line corresponds to total emissions that we would have seen on that prior slide. There's a number of similarities and differences between the scenarios. In terms of similarities, they all have much lower residual emissions in 2050 compared to our 2014 analysis, so some 2 to 4 times lower. What this reflects is really the progress in technology as discussed before. It's really important to also note that we weren't able to model all of the technologies we considered through our research in the modelling, because in many cases we just didn't have enough data on their cost or performance. But given what we've observed in the last 5 years, if we were to do this again in another 5 years, you could probably expect that we'd be able to model zero emissions across all sectors by 2050. In the meantime, we have used carbon forestry to compensate for those residual emissions. and to help us meet net zero emissions by 2050. In terms of other similarities, electricity moves towards 100% renewables pretty quickly, reaching this by 2050, and this really helps to decarbonise other sectors in the economy. Buildings and transport also get to zero or near zero emissions in all scenarios, and industry and agriculture really remain the hard nuts to crack with significant residual emissions even in 2050. The 1.5C all-in scenario, as you'd imagine, is by far the most ambitious. This achieves net zero emissions by 2035 and has net negative emissions thereafter, relying on a large volume of carbon forestry to do so. In terms of some of the other main differences between the scenarios, the rate of retirement of coal-powered electricity generation, which is slowest in the 2C Innovate scenario due to a relatively lower policy setting. That's the main difference in the electricity generation sector between the scenarios. Also varying degrees of uptake of industrial CCS, which particularly impacts emissions from the gas sector and is dependent again on policy assumptions. So once again, this is lowest in the 2C Innovate scenario relative to the other ones. We've also modelled varying levels of shifting to lower emissions construction materials, which has a big impact on industry emissions, and also the uptake of things like enteric fermentation treatments in the agricultural sector has a really significant impact on emissions in that sector. All of our scenarios see a much accelerated deployment of mature and demonstrated technologies compared to what we'd expect under business as usual. So a couple of examples here. While the government currently projects that around 1 in 5 cars will be electric by 2030, our scenarios see this number at around 1 in 2 by 2030 in our 2-degree scenarios, and about 3 in 4 of every car sold being electric by 2030 in our 1.5-degree scenario. Similar sort of story for renewables. While the government currently projects that we'll have around 50% by 2030, our scenarios put this number between 70 and 80%. So as well as these sort of more mature technologies, our scenarios also see accelerated development of those emerging solutions, such as renewable hydrogen, 2nd and 3rd generation biofuels, and also lab foods or enteric fermentation treatments, as I mentioned. And these solutions are then deployed at scale to varying degrees after 2030. Importantly, this kind of acceleration will not happen in time without strong action by governments, businesses, and individuals. So governments in particular have a really key role to play by developing supportive policies, removing roadblocks, making direct investments, and also incentivising private sector to both invest and to act themselves. Businesses will obviously be critical in aligning their products and services, their operations, R&D investments, and also their procurement to a net zero trajectory. And as we've seen, setting a net zero target can be a really important first step in this direction. Also worth noting this report's emphasis on the accelerated deployment of those mature technologies. So deployment is really what has enabled the recent progress we've observed in renewables and batteries, where it's helped achieve economies of scale and really driven significant cost savings. So in short, to cap off this sort of contextual piece, after missing our chance to reduce emissions in the last decade, we've now entered what some have termed the transformational decade for climate action. In order to stay within the global 1.5 and 2 degree climate goals, emissions really need to head towards zero at quite a steep pace. The good news is that we can do this through the accelerated deployment and development of available technologies and by leapfrogging to those zero emissions solutions. So I'll move into a few key findings now, looking at each sector. I just pulled out one slide per sector. Obviously, there'll be significantly more detail available in the main and technical reports for those interested. So starting off with electricity, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it's really all about renewables. These contribute around 75% of generation by 2030 in the scenarios and 100% by 2050. And as I mentioned, the transition is relatively similar across each of the sectors, with the main difference being in the 2C Innovate scenario, we do see coal generation hanging on a little longer due to a relatively lower policy setting compared to the other scenarios. Now, we know that from the literature that once you start reaching above sort of 50% renewable penetration, much more consideration needs to be given to storage and integration technologies like batteries. And although not shown explicitly here on this chart, they do play quite a big role in our modelling. Now, these might be chemical batteries, so your lithium ions, or this storage could equally be serviced by things like solar thermal or pumped hydro as well. And in reality, it's likely to be some combination of these or other emerging solutions. The renewable generation that we've got in our modelling, primarily composed of a mix of solar and wind, is really critical to replace existing fossil fuel generation. And the speed at which this happens affects the emissions of all of the electricity used across the economy. And this is super important because it not only reduces the emissions from the things that currently use electricity, but also reduces the emissions of potential new sources of demand due to electrification across the economy, which comes to be a really significant pillar of decarbonisation in all of our scenarios. Moving on to buildings now, and those with a keen eye would likely notice how the shape of the curve closely mirrors that of the electricity sector emissions. This is obviously to be expected given that buildings are already highly electric, but also really demonstrates how switching to use even more electric appliances, such as for heating, particular solutions that are rapidly improving in performance and cost, really takes advantage of a decarbonising electricity grid. Buildings are also pretty interesting as they're likely to be the site of a significant share of renewable energy generation, particularly through rooftop solar PV. And going forward, the opportunity to incorporate smarter equipment, including things like electric vehicles parked in the garage, could further strengthen the role of buildings through demand management. But the building sector is much more than just future technology options. There's also massive opportunities in improving efficiency and increasing electrification now. And these are things that can happen sort of right away. What this means is constructing and upgrading buildings to require the least possible energy from the outset and fitting out those buildings with the most efficient equipment. And this will play a really big role in reducing energy use and emissions in the near term. So shifting to transport now, and each of our scenarios shows near zero emissions by 2050 for transport. And the charts we've got up here is an example of our 2C Innovate scenario. So looking first at the chart on the left there, and in particular the two lighter blue sections of that chart, you can see that road transport really dominates the emissions profile of the transport sector, and actually historically has grown really significantly. So since around 1990, I believe it's around 60% increase in emissions just from those road transport sectors. It's in these road transport modes where the key strategy for abatement is really electrification. So battery electric and some fuel cell as well, including autonomous vehicles that reduce these emissions substantially. So while the next decade might look unremarkable in terms of emissions reductions, particularly compared to the sort of electricity and building sectors that we just run through, the cresting of those emissions in light of the historical rise is actually quite significant. And what this is really driven by the uptake of electric vehicles, which you can see in the right-hand chart there, particularly post sort of 2030, where uptake really explodes after reaching cost parity with internal combustion engine vehicles around the middle of the 2020s. For other transport modes, pursuing alternative fuels such as bioenergy could play a really significant role in reducing emissions in those sectors. So, industry, quite a complex story. So first I'll draw your attention to the left-hand chart. There's quite a few things to note. So first of all, when you include electricity use, industry accounts for around half of Australia's emissions, and these are distributed across quite diverse industrial subsectors. What this chart on the left also shows is the diversity in emissions types. So unlike the last few sectors where we've covered, where the bulk of emissions are exclusively from actually energy use, industry also has significant non-energy emissions, so fugitive and process emissions arising from production. And given that the subsectors here included here undertake such a wide range of activity, and some in particular are highly specialised, the abatement solutions required vary quite significantly. But the emissions trajectory for industry in the various scenarios is shown on the right-hand side. So we see a reduction of at least 79% by 2050 compared to 2020. This is achieved through numerous avenues. So firstly, a mature solution that cuts across all sectors is improving efficiency. So beyond the typical behaviour change and equipment upgrades, improvements could also be had through things like artificial intelligence and automation, which could significantly reduce energy needs in various sectors. Efficiency can also be improved through the application of circular economy principles, like increasing the capture and recycling of metals and reducing the need to produce new steel, or by transitioning towards materials with lower energy intensities, such as timber buildings, potentially replacing steel in some buildings. Another abatement opportunity is the electrification of processing and transportation of commodities and manufacturing processes. So this is particularly the case for low to medium heat requirements, including things like electric arc furnace manufacturing or LNG electrification. And these could be really significant, as could switching from fossil fuels to renewable sources for other industrial heating purposes, such as through bioenergy or solar thermal or other mixes. And of course, reducing those very important non-energy emissions, some of which can be a benefit from shifting to materials with lower emissions intensities, such as geopolymer cement, which both reduces heat requirements and the emissions from chemical reactions during production, or otherwise implementing improvements in other production processes like catalysts for chemicals, or through the application of CCS. Many of these solutions still face really significant barriers, and some are very much still emerging, so there's room for further investigation on how to reduce industrial emissions even further. And this is something we're actually exploring in much greater detail in another program of work at ClimateWorks in our Australian Industry Energy Transitions Initiative, where we're building on work recently conducted by the Energy Transition Commission to explore how we can achieve net zero emissions supply chains in Australia. So the last sector I'll run through is agriculture, and on the topic of emerging solutions, one of the single most important opportunities for abatement could come from this sector. In particular, solutions aimed at reducing or eliminating non-energy emissions from livestock, such as the development of an effective anti-methane vaccine and delivery mechanism. Product substitutes are also becoming more widely available, and a focus on reducing waste throughout the supply chain could also play a really significant part in changing the emissions profile of livestock. So you can see that most clearly in obviously the 2C innovate and the 1.5C all-in scenario, with quite a stark drop-off in emissions, particularly from sheep and beef cattle. However, that doesn't totally remove emissions from the sector, however, and there still remain significant residual emissions from other subsectors. So this is where sustainable agricultural practices can play a big role, such as fertiliser and manure management, among others. Now, given its interface with some really complex environmental issues, as well as challenges such as population growth, food security, and various competing land uses, the analysis that we've done in Decarbonisation Futures is, I guess, somewhat simplistic in that it only focuses primarily on emissions reduction. So similar to industry, we sort of acknowledge this limitation and are looking at food and land use in significantly more detail in another program of work at ClimateWorks, our Land Use Futures project, which will explore in much more detail sort of competing demands on food and land and fibre production, while also supporting environmental outcomes like biodiversity and the like. Won't spend too much time on these next couple of slides, more just a demonstration of another output through this report. As I mentioned, we've developed a few key benchmarks for technology uptake in each of the sectors and scenarios to assess really what on track looks like for each of the scenarios in 2030. And also developed similar benchmarks for energy and emissions across each of the sectors. So these are available in the main report for anyone who's interested in a little bit more detail. So I'll wrap up on this one simple, although slightly busy slide by saying that essentially most of the technology solutions I've mentioned today and that we've covered in the report are pretty well understood. So they don't require a radical redesign of life as we know it. They enable us to still live and work in similar buildings, use similar vehicles to now, and consume similar products to now, but importantly, to do so without creating emissions. For the most part, they replace an existing energy source with a fuel that doesn't emit, or they substitute the material used for a version that can be made with less emissions. The problem is more that the solutions are not yet being widely purchased and installed, and they really need to be. To achieve the Paris climate goals, we have to halve our emissions by 2030 at the latest. So the next decade is clearly really important. Decarbonisation Futures research shows that we actually have the technological capacity in the Australian economy to get there, but we really need to get these technologies out the door at every opportunity. But to do this, can't just rely on one actor, whether this be government, businesses or consumers, but really need to go all in to meet the challenges of the transformational decade for climate. So I'll end the sort of main part of my presentation there. As I mentioned, there's much more information about the model scenarios, specific sectoral assumptions in our technical report, which is up on our website now, and a link provided there, as well as obviously significantly more detail in the main report, also available on our website. So I'll hand back to Rebecca, I think, and we'll open up to some questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Cameron. That was fantastic. It's always great to see scenario analysis like this that demonstrates both what's achievable and also what needs to happen in the scale of the challenge. So we've got lots of questions and I'll move through them. Hopefully we'll get through them all. And if we don't, Cameron has said he's available for a short time at the end if we need to carry on. But can I also ask you to, for all those who have raised questions, it would be really helpful to me as moderating it for you to raise your hand so that I can type your question in and then raise your hand so we can, I can easily unmute you. So we'll start with Jim Orchard. I'll allow you to talk now, Jim. Can you, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Cameron. Thanks for that presentation. My question was around the sort of storage technologies that we'll need for, say, 100% renewables. Most of the studies I've read focus on pumped hydro as being the most developed technology for large-scale, grid-scale storage. Do you see that playing out, or do you see other technologies and perhaps some gas with CCS being part of the mix when we get to, a zero carbon electricity sector?
Yeah, so for the most part, all of our storage requirements in the modelling are met through a combination of residential, commercial, utility scale batteries, as well as we've got pretty significant amounts of solar thermal electricity generation. So that is basically the storage mix that grows throughout the modelling period. We've got some existing pumped hydro in there, which doesn't, we didn't make any assumptions around sort of expansion of that. And probably important to note that also doesn't include Snowy 2.0 or sort of battery of the nation type stuff. These weren't included in the modelling as at the time they weren't sort of approved or considered being definite starters, but in saying that they are now and would be included in sort of any future analysis. But yeah, based on sort of input cost assumptions, the model really chooses to support our renewables with a combination of batteries and solar thermal storage. And we don't have any CCS in the electricity generation sector.
Great, thanks, Cameron. Neil Marshman, would you like to ask your question next?
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Cameron. It's great to hear of the work, and I think the way in which technology has progressed over the last 20 years or so, which leads me to a question on costs and economics. What type of implicit carbon price would all of this entail, and how might that carbon price have changed since the work was done a decade ago?
Yep, so great question. In each of the scenarios, we do have a carbon price that is essentially, that acts as our policy driver. So it's not to say that this is necessarily the level of a carbon price that would need to be set by a government, but really represents a range of policy actions or the like. Off the top of my head, I don't have the numbers to hand, but it does increase to around between $200 and $300 by 2050. So that's a sort of order of magnitude. So yes, we do have a carbon price in the model that drives those emissions reductions. Does that kind of answer your question? Or?
Thanks, Cameron. Ursula, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hello, and good morning here from Perth, Western Australia. Thanks a lot, Cameron, for this great presentation, and great to see you again, Rebecca. Yeah, my question is in relation to the pathways and the assumptions about the carbon budget and when it is necessary to reach net zero. You seem to assume that for 1.5 pathway, which is the Paris Agreement temperature limit, one would have to achieve net zero total greenhouse gas emissions in 2035, and I couldn't really find the explanation for that in the main report, although I see the technical report is out now. It wasn't out recently. So yeah, I was wondering, and that seems to lead to a reliance on carbon forestry, quite extremely so. And in the chat, I've also sent a link to a publication we have done for Western Australia. We've also done a similar for Queensland, where we reach a different conclusion for a 1.5 pathway. So I'd like to hear how you came to that conclusion of this net zero by 2035.
Yep, great question. So the way that we've arrived at the carbon budget for Australia is sort of a combination of methods, but basically taking a similar approach to that taken by the Climate Change Authority. So assuming a 0.97% share of global carbon budgets. And we've adapted our Australian carbon budget for a 1.5 degree scenario from the IPCC's special report into 1.5 degrees. As well as some research from Malta, actually from this institute, to arrive at a total carbon budget, I believe, of around 7 gigatonne between 2018 and 2050. And that relates to a 50% chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees or less. So really the net zero by 2035 allows us to remain within that 7 gigatonne limit without any overshoot. The really significant negative emissions thereafter is more or less to, although there's significant uncertainty around the concept of overshooting and returning back under a particular budget, the negative emissions thereafter are sort of, the hypothesis is that would increase the chances of limiting global warming to less than 1.5 degrees. So not to say that the 50% budget is reliant on those negative emissions. We don't overshoot that budget at all, but we would overshoot the 67% budget.
Great, thanks, Cameron. Alex Peel, we might come to you next.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
You did say Alex Peel, right?
Yes, that's right.
It's my turn. Yeah, so I just had a couple of questions really related. So I'm in the sector in Victoria, so obviously we're very interested in emissions reduction pathways. And a couple of things. Firstly, in the transport sector, you mentioned water transport. So I just wanted to be clear what exactly was meant by that. Because the way often I think of water transport is around water supply, so pipelines, but this might not be that. So that was the first one. And the second one was related to buildings. Obviously, there's a lot of linkages between water-based emissions and buildings. So just interested in what your thoughts generally are on that, but also whether the information you provided earlier includes the embodied emissions in buildings more particular. So thanks for that.
Could you just expand a little bit more on what you mean by water-related emissions, just to help?
Yeah, so for, buildings have a very, I suppose if you think how water is used in an apartment or in a home, hot water systems, for example, a very, very big part of emissions more broadly. I think 27% of emissions in Melbourne from a home come from water heating. So it's a big component. So how a building is designed and the appliances within it, it's very important. So I think generally that's the area that I'm talking about, but happy to provide a little bit more info.
Yep, sure. Okay, so yeah, in terms of your first question, no, it's not related to water supply. So water transport is actually the use of watercraft domestically. So it doesn't include things like international shipping. So that might be, yeah, some domestic shipping, but also personal use of various watercrafts. In terms of embodied emissions, no. So the emissions that you see in those end use sectors that I presented do not include, so buildings specifically, do not include embodied emissions. So we've got a construction subsector which lives in industry where the emissions associated with construction of buildings would live. And then in terms of the treatment of things like water heating and the like in buildings, so we do have pretty granular detail in the modelling of various end uses within the building sector, so lighting, heating, water heating, cooking, among others. So I'd invite you to yeah, have a look at the technical report for a bit more detail on that. But yeah, in short, yes, it is part of the modelling, and it is something that we specifically do treat.
Great, thanks, Cameron. Liz Glab, would you like to ask your question now? Thank you.
Thank you so much what your organisation and other organisations do, all this amazing work, and it makes technical, scientific, economic sense. But how do we actually get it implemented? Something that resembles sensible policy. I noticed in Christiana Figueres, who's known as the architect of the Paris Agreement, in her book, The Future We Choose, she says civil disobedience is not only a moral choice, it is also the most powerful way to shape world politics. So how do you see the best way to get, say, your policies implemented?
That's quite a huge question, and I don't want to go on the record as advocating civil disobedience. It's definitely not the official line of ClimateWorks. In terms of getting things enacted, I'd probably defer, and it's not necessarily something that. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the slide here. Yeah, it's something that we're looking to build out in a lot more detail. What the purpose of this research was really to show or to explore whether achieving these sorts of emissions reductions are possible, and really the implementation of those is the next bit that follows on from that. So, you know, probably the best way to describe it is these various actions that we've identified at the government, businesses and individual level of what you can really do to support the transition. But yeah, obviously noting that these are relatively simplistic, and the implementation and implications of this research is definitely something that we're looking to build out a lot in our sort of engagement with various bodies and different briefings that we've done as well. So yeah, I'd probably defer to that. And I'm not sure I can really provide much more than that, sorry.
Thanks, Cameron. Russell Williams, would you like to ask your question next?
Thanks, Cameron. My question's sort of a little bit related in that all of these initiatives are really good. Some of them will be driven by carbon pricing, but for those that aren't, how will we fund these things? And I'm thinking particularly for a lot of legacy buildings, infrastructure, etc., that need to be upgraded to the latest tech, the latest standards, etc. How are we going to fund those, and what assumptions have you made? Because I'm seeing that there's going to be a tail end which will take a long time to convert, because certain sectors just cannot afford to invest in the new tech, the new infrastructure that's required.
Yeah, so I mean, we did consider throughout the project having another driver of emissions reduction being investment, and obviously it's implicit in all of these solutions that we're advocating here. I think it really depends on the sector that you're talking about, and it's not only about the investment of turning over various assets and the like, but also being really smart about the decisions we're making in terms of what we're investing in now to avoid locking in assets in higher emitting assets and the like. So yeah, I think beyond a carbon price, which is obviously one direct way that a government can stimulate investment, there's a range of other ways through direct investment and funding of various organisations like ARENA and CEFC that do some really, really good work in the deployment of those sort of more emerging or demonstrated technologies, but also some of the burden to fall on individuals in terms of the fitting of their buildings and the like. It's kind of fairly sector dependent. When you look at road transport, our research sort of sees private vehicles being cost competitive with conventional vehicles around the middle of this decade, and obviously those things take some time to wash through the system. So there's things that governments or businesses can do now in terms of procuring vehicles for their fleets, which then really flows through to the secondhand market and the like. So I think just embedding these sort of emissions reduction solutions or things that are coming through the pipeline into sort of those longer term investment decisions is really the best way to get action happening in the sort of short to medium term.
Thanks, Cameron. Stuart McLean, we'll come to you next. Could I invite all the people asking questions, if they'd like to introduce themselves and give some context to their question, that would be great. Of course, feel free not to as well. But we've got a really great bunch of people joining us today, and it's interesting to hear where everyone's from.
Okay, Rebecca?
Yes, I think we can hear you.
You can hear me okay? Good. Just testing. Yeah, Stuart McLean, my name. I'm currently retired, but I had a long employment history within the steel industry, and also I was mainly dealing with the automotive industry within the steel industry. So my question was around way back in about 2000. I went to a conference, and fuel cells and hydrogen were very much on the agenda. But they seem to have gone very quiet now, and battery technology seems to have taken over. Now, Cameron, I noticed on your chart you had fuel cell was growing at a very slow rate. So I'm just interested to know your view about why fuel cells are not taking off much faster. Again, they are fueled by hydrogen. Hydrogen now starting to be recognised again as a possible option for to our emissions.
Yeah.
What fuels are taking on the battery issue?
Sure. Unfortunately, I didn't catch the sort of back half of your question there, but I think I got the gist of where you're going. Perhaps surprisingly lower amounts of fuel cell vehicles that we've got coming through in road transport is probably more a reflection of the really steep reduction in chemical battery costs in recent decades. Oh, sorry, not recent decades, the recent decade. So I'm sure if you compared this research to what we did last time, we would have seen perhaps a much larger share of fuel cell vehicles, but what the reduction in battery costs has meant that really it's opened the door to a wider range of vehicle types being electrified through sort of battery electric vehicles, where fuel cell vehicles really fill that gap on the sort of heavier transport modes in the road segment. So yeah, I guess key takeaway is that based on sort of current cost inputs or projected cost inputs, we're seeing a much larger role for pure battery electric relative to fuel cell.
Great, thank you. Sarah Milanko, I think this might be our last question, but as I said at the start, Cameron's offered to give us a little bit more time, so those who would like to stay on the call, please do, and we can continue questions for another few minutes.
Thank you both. I'm a doctor in Victoria. I don't have any specific affiliations. I'm interested into whether the report took into account regenerative agricultural practices. I had a quick look. I couldn't see it in the full report or the technical report.
No, in short, no. But I know certainly this is something that's being considered in the Land Use Futures program of work that I mentioned. So this is a 3-year program of work that's in its first year currently. And yeah, there are a few decisions made at the beginning and during Decarbonisation Futures. The probably two biggest ones being not to include the use and production of hydrogen in industry, as well as a more simplified view of the agricultural sector, recognising that we were going to explore these things in much more detail in dedicated programs of work, given that these are such hard to abate sectors. So yeah, I'd invite you to look on our website for our Land Use Futures program and any sort of outputs that emerge from that, because I know that they're definitely looking into the possibilities around regenerative agriculture.
Great. Thank you so much, Cameron, and thank you for everybody who's attended us. It's really fantastic to have you all joining us here this morning, and that was an excellent presentation, Cameron, and really, really interesting research. It's now 12 o'clock, so we'll call that phase of the presentation to an end. I'll just flag with everybody that we have some upcoming seminars that we'll be hosting, and we'd love you to join us for those as well. And then, as I said, those who would like to stay on the line should stay on the line. So the next seminars that are being hosted by the Energy Transition Hub and the Climate and Energy College, just try and share my screen so you can read it. Yes, so on Wednesday the 20th of May, we have Damien Jones from Climate Analytics talking about international climate negotiations. He's an excellent speaker, and I'm sure it'll be fantastic. And then on Thursday the 21st of May, we have Stephen Pollard talking about locating net zero emissions, which is an ethnographic comparison of local approaches to community scale carbon neutrality, and will also be an excellent conversation. So thank you all for joining us, and those who would like to stay on the call to continue with questions, please do so, and I'll continue to moderate those in the same way.